Are you all ready for our next presidential candidate? Woo! All right, coming to the stage, the senator from New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker. Hey, good to see you. All right, you ready to go?
Hello, everybody. Hello. I want to thank everybody for being here. And before I get to my big idea, I want to talk about, just for a second, we had another mass shooting in America yesterday. And these cannot just go on in our country. We used to be a nation that when 4 girls were killed in a bombing in Birmingham, we changed laws. When women were killed in the shirtwaist factory fire, we changed laws. We are seeing too much death in our country, which reminds us of the most important big idea, which isn't new. Before I get to mine, I want to repeat that because that's why we're here. The best big idea is that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. And when the people are united, they cannot be defeated. And so this kind of gathering about letting us understand that we are stronger and more powerful when we are together, standing, working, fighting. And this is a time that we got to be a people coming together to move on up, and in this election to make sure that Donald Trump out of the White House moves on out. And so, my campaign, we've got a lot of big policy ideas, but I want to get to the heart of one of the issues that is most threatening to our democracy, which is wealth disparity. We are a nation where too often the destiny of children is defined by the wealth of their families, the kind of schools they go to, the kind of housing they have. We are allowing wealth disparities in this country to grow to gargantuan proportions. Since the 1960s to recent times, we've seen the wealth of the wealthiest Americans be 6 times that of average working Americans. It's exploded to now 12 times that. And not only is this insidious in undermining the success of so many children, so many families, we've seen racial disparities grow over recent decades. To now the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average black family, being compounded by the racial disparities in generation after generation of overtly racist policies, of terrorist actions like 98 years ago today, in a place they call Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was bombed and looted by white supremacists, all the way to mass incarceration, which further, through its racial disparities, freezes and expands racial wealth gap. My big idea addresses the wealth inequalities in our country as well as the racial wealth gap in our country by saying a nation that uses hundreds of billions of dollars to transfer wealth to people that already have it through our tax code, it's about time we target the creation of wealth equally for all children in America. And my idea to do that is something called baby bonds, making sure that every child born in America gets an interest-bearing account with $1,000 in it. And then depending on the wealth of your family, you get up to $2,000 placed into that account every single year. For the lowest income kids, that means by the time that you're 18 years old, you can have upwards of $50,000 in an account that can be used to invest in things that create wealth, like going to college or buying a home. In America, paychecks help you get by, but wealth helps you get ahead and create generational wealth and strength. And my legislation already has been reviewed by Columbia University, who said it literally erases for young Americans the racial wealth gap in this country. We are a nation where it should not be survival of the children of the wealthiest. It should be understanding that when wealth is created, people have agency. They can pursue their dreams. That was the idea of America for my father, who didn't have wealth. He was born poor. He used to tell me, son, I was born so poor I couldn't afford to be poor. I was just P-O. I couldn't afford the other 2 letters. But it was a community that brought together their community wealth. A church that gave him the money he needed to enroll in college, that changed the destiny of my family. We need to make sure that every child has the resources they need to live their American dream, to create wealth, to pass something on to their children, to make sure that we take these racial wealth gaps and these growing wealth gaps and wealth inequality in our country and we get rid of it. We can do those things if we stand together and dream bigger dreams. This election is not just about getting one guy out of office. We need to have a bigger aspiration for that. It should be an election where we dream big again in America. Dreams of equality, dreams of opportunity, dreams of health care for all, college for those who want it, dreams that everybody has a pathway to work with dignity and a pathway to make sure that their American dream is truly possible. Thank you, everybody.
Economists and other professionals have really said wonderful things about your legislation. But I do want to ask you, why start there? All the ways to tackle income inequality, why baby bonds? Why there?
Well, first of all, I don't start there. You know, if you look at the policies we're rolling out, like a massive increase in the earned income tax credit. Right now, we target these Trump toxic tax credits, go to the wealthiest corporations, the wealthiest people. My tax bill says, no, we're going to give 150 million Americans, working Americans, a pay increase, and we're going to make sure that literally my plan would cut poverty in a third. But still remember that paychecks help people get by. We're still not dealing with the wealth gap. And you know this, for black families in America who earn the same as white families, they still are dramatically behind in wealth. In Boston, the average white family has $242,000 of wealth created. The average black family, $8. And so what we've got to solve is not just pay income disparities, we've got to solve this problem we have of intergenerational wealth disparities. And that's why one of the parts of my plan of making this a nation economically that works for everybody is focusing not just on helping people get ahead with pay with dignity, raising the minimum wage, but helping people create wealth. That's what Baby Bonds does.
Yeah. I've heard you talk a lot about being born on third base, right? And the story that you tell about what your dad used to tell you about being born on third base, which means you were given certain advantages in your life. Can you talk a little bit about what experiences in your own life helped you to shape this particular policy and why you decided to do it now?
So my parents literally had to get a white couple to pose as them to move into, in 1969, to move into a middle-class community where we had the best public schools in New Jersey, massive stratification, redlining, and mortgage laws created. We're one of the top most racially segregated states in the country. And so to break through that, African-American families also had to do great lengths to move into a neighborhood. But when I was growing up, my dad's like, boy, don't walk around this house like you hit a triple. You were born on third base. But I know people fought for my housing rights, so the first thing I did when I came out of law school was move to the inner city, Newark, New Jersey, to do what? Fight for other people's housing rights.
Yep.
And I still live there today. And so I'm the only United States senator that lives in a black and brown community below the poverty line where we do not mistake wealth with worth. And when I see how my families in my neighborhood are by no makings of their own screwed over. There are 3,000 jurisdictions in this country where children have more than twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan.
Right.
In my community, they drink out of bottled water in some of our schools. In my neighborhood, people don't understand, when there's shootings, there is trauma in communities.
Yes.
Shahad Smith was murdered on my block. I've tried to show people in my book that one shooting in front of an IHOP in my neighborhood, the IHOP had to cancel the late night shift, which meant a whole bunch of people were relying on those jobs, didn't have them. It multiplies. So communities like mine are suffering that way. The criminal justice system. In Stanford, I smelled a lot of pot, but people weren't getting arrested for it. But in communities like mine, if you're black in America, no difference between using marijuana or dealing marijuana, but almost 4 times more likely, which has an economic consequence.
Right.
All of these things and more have compounded in my communities and informed the policy, because I'm the senator that goes home to a community that's in struggle, and everything I do is done through the lens of what's going to help people that are being left out, left aside, looked down upon, be successful in our country. And that's what fuels my work and my policy.
All right. So, Senator, as you know, we've asked MoveOn members to send a question, and we're going to pivot to that for a second. And this could be about any topic.
Yeah, sure.
So we have one from Avi, a MoveOn member from Pennsylvania, and he asks, We are experiencing a resurgence of white supremacist and neo-Nazi ideology in this country, with several violent attacks carried out and many more attempted. What actions will you take to not only call out such ideology and behavior, but to stop the spread of such hate and violence and prevent further radicalization? What can be done through legislation and executive action?
Well, let's be clear, because Senator Sanders said this about the trillions of dollars we spent under a 2001 and 2002 authorization of military force to stop terrorism. Now, keep that in mind, that number he mentioned, trillions of dollars. But yet, since 9/11, the majority of terrorist attacks in our country have been homegrown right-wing groups. And the majority of them have been white supremacist attacks. And so for a president not to even admit that that is a problem in our country, not to put resources like we should be doing into stopping that kind of terrorism that makes people afraid to go to worship in their synagogue or their mosque, that makes people afraid to go out into their neighborhoods or for their children to go to school, that's what we need to be talking about and having strategies to deal with. So the first thing is you're going to have a president and me up in the White House that is calling out white supremacy, which for what it is, a threat to our democracy, our safety, and our security. And I'm going to make sure that the Justice Department of the United States of America investigates these white supremacist groups that are causing and pushing and propagating this kind of terror. And I'm going to make sure that here out in Silicon Valley, that these social media platforms do not become platforms for hate and bigotry. And I'm going to make sure that we invest in communities to have more resiliency. The way you confront hate is not by ignoring it, but you propagate the kind of things that are the best counter to hate, which is to create a more beloved community. And a beloved community isn't just words. Love is not just a sentiment. Love is saying, hey, if your kids don't have a great public school, then my kids are less off. If your kids are being bullied in school because 30% of our LGBTQ youth in this country, let them tell you about the terrorism that they experience because they miss school because of fear of what's happening. I'm going to be a president that understands that our values are not just slogans, liberty and justice for all, that it's work and struggle and sacrifice, because patriotism is love of country, and you cannot love your country unless you love all of your countrymen and women. And if you want to lead in America, you can't lead the people if you don't love the people, all the people.
Last question. I think we've got one more time for one more question. These are crazy times, is big understatement, but the daily abuse of power that we see from the White House and the administration and the usurpation of the rule of law is mind-boggling. Yeah. Do you think that we are in a constitutional crisis today? And if so, what is the role of the people in this room as activists to make sure we can hold on to our democracy as we know it?
I mean, clearly we are in a point where there is a crisis in our country. Here's a president that was elected by a minority of Americans because of a constitutional rule that said, hey, if you win the Electoral College, you can have millions of people more vote against you. So he got in there by abiding and demanding that we abide by the mandates of the Constitution. But then he gets in there and says to Congress, I'm above you. I'm not subject to your checks and balances. I won't cooperate with your subpoenas. That is unacceptable in this country, especially when you have a Mueller report that speaks to deceit and lies and speaks towards potential obstruction of justice. That's why I'm saying the House of Representatives should move towards impeachment proceedings. But if you ask me right now, when you have people moving in undemocratic fashions to suppress votes and to do things that are undemocratic, the cure for that is more democracy, is more engagement, is more activism. Let us remember the wisdom of King, who said we have to repent in this day and age, not just for the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. This election, we have to understand, is not a spectator sport. You can't just sit home, watch MSNBC and say, cheer for your team, red or blue. This election will not be decided by how much we cheer, but how much we get on the field and say, I am a player in this democracy. I have the power. I'm going to determine the destiny. And so this election, we don't need a savior in our democracy. Don't let any candidate say only I can solve these problems. What we need is not one person in one office. We need 300 million Americans and a chorus of conviction calling to the consciousness of this country and say it's time that we take back our democracy for the people of the United States of America. God bless you and thank you.
All right. Preach. Preach.